Welcome to Heroes That Help, brought to you by the Missouri Department of Mental Health through the Disaster Response State Grant, funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Heroes That Help, conversations with heroes who respond to disasters, natural and man-made, that wreak havoc every year in Missouri. I'm Tom Steever. The impact of natural disasters goes beyond damage and physical injury. There is mental suffering among those recovering from disaster-related trauma. This compassionate caution from the Missouri Department of Mental Health. Some of the information we discuss in this visual radio series may be distressing or traumatizing for some people. If you need help, we encourage you to reach out to supportive people. There is help available through behavioral health services, including treatment for mental illness and substance use disorders. We're talking with Rachel Jones, the manager of Trauma-Informed Care and director of the Disaster Response State Grant at the Missouri Department of Mental Health, and more specifically, the Division of Behavioral Health. Our guest is Rachel Jones with the Missouri Department of Mental Health. Rachel, thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Tom.
So tell me about your work at the Missouri Department of Mental Health.
I'm the manager of Trauma-Informed Care. I help advance trauma knowledge, practices for all kinds of industries and professions that are impacted by trauma so that they can deliver better services and take care of their workforce better. And then I'm also the director of this Disaster Response State Grant. And this grant is supporting 26 counties in Missouri that were impacted by natural disasters in 2019. Severe storms, floods, and tornadoes. And we are doing treatment, so people get access to substance use treatment and mental health services. That might be individual therapy, medications, family therapy, different things like that. But also a big component of this grant is information, education, and training, which is how we are able to do this Heroes That Help visual radio series. Really trying to educate the public about who gets involved with disasters, how does it impact them, and how do they recover from it too.
Tell me about your interactions with people, with survivors of disasters in your role in disaster response.
I would say it's two primary ways. The first is through our contracted providers who are really boots on the ground in those communities responding to people. And so I'm working with them and I'm hearing about the stories. I'm trying to help them problem solve and troubleshoot issues that the people in those communities need. But another way is that people sometimes do email or call the Department of Mental Health because they need someone to talk to. They have questions about the disaster, how it impacted their community and what they're supposed to do next and who we can connect them to. And so sometimes I do get the opportunity to do some one-on-one with someone through phone or email to try to connect them to a local resource.
I want to know more about the risk factors of those people who have experienced loss and grief resulting from a disaster. What is the, how are survivors vulnerable to mental health or addiction issues if they're experiencing loss and grief?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first highest risk factor is if you had previous mental health problems, anxiety, depression, trauma, because then this new thing would exacerbate that potentially. So anyone who's already living with a condition is going to be more vulnerable, and it'll be a little harder, perhaps, for them to recover from a disaster. I think another main contributor that makes people vulnerable is a lack of protective factors, not having a support around them, whether that's family support, financial support, a community that has resources available that can come together after times of disaster. So anybody who's already struggling with mental health or substance use, anyone who doesn't have access to those supports and connections, it's going to be a little harder for them to recover from a disaster. It's possible. It just takes a little longer. They may have to strategize differently. They may have some setbacks. They may go for several months without knowing what to do, so those symptoms get worse and things get delayed. So I'd say those are probably the two main ones that put people in a vulnerable state.
How is age a factor in this? Would an adult be any more susceptible than a young person?
I don't know if they'd be more susceptible. I think that adults have more responsibilities in terms of disaster. Let's say they have land, or they have a home, they have a job, they have responsibilities to care for kids or grandkids at home. And so a disaster strikes, they may feel that differently because of all those additional lived experiences and responsibilities that they have. And so it may be a lot of pressure and stress for them because they're not only trying to manage it for themselves, but responsible for other people too. But on the flip side of that, even though children are very resilient, they can recover and learn quickly from things, they also rely on the adults in their life, right? So if the adult in their life is under distress and not doing well, that child's going to feel that, and that does put them at risk too. So I don't know that one is more at risk than the other, but they certainly play off of each other because family systems are really important, right? And in disaster work, because a lot of disaster is going to impact a community and a home and a family system, both parties, youth and adult, are at risk, and we're always trying to find ways to help stabilize family systems.
What about specific examples of what you have seen, what you have witnessed by way of addiction or depression problems as a result of disaster?
Well, I used to work in substance use treatment, and I always found it interesting when people would tell their addiction story. They would tell their origin story. It's basically, tell us the first time you really started using. And I was surprised how many of them were about in high school, and it was usually around a traumatic event that occurred, and a lot of times it was a fire, it was an accident, it was a storm that came through the community that destroyed stuff, and they didn't have resources and skills to manage with the grief, manage with the stress, so they turned to alcohol and drugs. And it was a slippery slope because what started as, this is really hard and overwhelming, I don't know what else to do, so let me just use, turned into months and years of use, which then introduced other problems, which set them down a road where they may have really struggled the first part of adulthood to the point where, eventually they are unable to manage in relationships with romantic partners. They have trouble raising their own children and teaching stress tolerance to someone else because they don't even really know it very well themselves. So I certainly had a lot of experience in substance use treatment, seeing how that initial trauma can really set somebody up to not know what else to do besides numb the pain and just escape from it because it's overwhelming. And then what that can do later is develop long-term addiction, which takes a lot of time to recover from, and it impacts a lot of other people.
What about you, Rachel? How are you personally affected by having to go through this, by dealing with the people, helping the people who have been affected by disaster?
Yeah.
What's your release?
My release is multiple things. One thing that may be a little surprising is I try really hard to not engage in any entertainment or consume anything that has trauma in it. And that's hard to do. If you actually look at media in general, in our culture, there's a lot of trauma that is portrayed in media. And so I have to be really cautious about what I do in my downtime and what I consume, because I consume so much of it as a part of work and as service to my community. You got to have the balance. So I work hard to do that. I try to stay physically active. I try to connect to other people who can handle the depth and the gravity of doing trauma work, because what you see, what you hear, what you witness is very heavy stuff that not everyone can manage well. And you got to be cautious about who you give that to and who you share it with, right? And so I try to have a small but supportive group of people who get it so that I can talk to them about it. Try not to tell my family about it and get into detail and expose them to unnecessary grief and trauma exposure. I love my dogs. I like to be active outside. I spend time in nature because that's very healing. And those are, I would say, some of the things off the top of my head that I can think of. But it's also just an ongoing lifestyle where you kind of have to change it over time. Things happen, you evolve and grow, you get wiser. Other challenges come up in life, you got to kind of shift. Something that used to work, which was really effective, it doesn't really work anymore. Now you got to find something new, right? Yeah. So I'm always researching wellness, because that's the flip side of trauma, is really promoting wellness and living that so that you can manage the trauma better when it does come up.
But I'm hearing that a support group, be it 2 legs or 4 legs, is important.
That's right. Yeah. Whether furry or not, it's important. Absolutely.
So you're the director of the Disaster Response State Grant. How has that grant helped to bolster Missouri's response to disasters and also to mental health disorders?
Well, first is we were able to provide funding to communities that were impacted by it. And, you know, a lot of times in Missouri, our rural communities are the ones impacted by natural disasters, where there may not be a lot of resources anyway. So being able to just provide them additional funds so that they can reach out to more people, do assessments and screenings, and provide treatment, whatever that needs to look like. Another thing we were able to do that I think bolsters our disaster response, we were able to pay for naloxone distribution around the state for those counties so that we can prevent overdose deaths and save people's lives. So that was great. And then the really creative, fun stuff has come on the information and education and training side, where we're able to reach so many different professions that have a role in this work, but often do not. People don't know it. I mean, even in this video series and hearing from all the different professionals who really are heroes. They do not wear capes. They're not always on the front page of the newspaper. They're not interviewed on the radio. People don't know their story. They don't know how they connect, but they're heroes. And I think this work has really helped bolster that. I hope that it helps highlight that Missouri's got a really great disaster response team. We have a system that works. We have organizations that connect to each other. It's an interdisciplinary approach. And I hope Missourians will find some sense of relief and confidence in that you've got a lot of people who care, who are working on it around the clock, year long, whether it's sunny skies or stormy skies. You know, people have dedicated their profession, they've dedicated their work to really trying to help Missourians. So I hope that part of what we're doing here with this particular series is also helping to bolster all those professions, understanding it, them understanding how trauma impacts each of them and what they can do in their own profession to have more conversations, to support staff differently, to get access to help for people who need it. So I hope that that's one of the ways that we're bolstering our disaster response through this grant.
So what would you like to add to this, Rachel, that I may have left out?
One thing that I would like to just help people understand, because sometimes when you think disaster, people almost always think of the immediate impact of it. The recovery just takes so many months afterwards. And you know, after those initial things are handled and those temporary services go away, a lot of people in the community are sitting with the grief, the loss, the change, the adjustment, just the difference that their day-to-day life now means for them. And so we need to just have grace and compassion that recovery takes a while. And sometimes people are trying to recover in isolation and in silence. And it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to say, man, that tornado came through in 2019. I'm still having trouble. I know that it's a year or so later. It's still kind of hard for me. It's okay to say that. It's okay to admit that. And I hope that we can be a society where we allow people to grieve at their own pace, no matter how long that takes, and constantly look for opportunities to get them access to resources. Instead of people feeling ashamed that I should have got through it, oh, that was a year ago, nobody's talking about it anymore, I just need to get on with it. It's just not that easy sometimes, you know, and we just need to be a patient culture that says, hey, everybody's going at their own pace here, and there's resources available to help, and no shame. If you're still struggling, feel free to tell somebody about that, because there's people who can help.
Well, thank you, Rachel Jones with the Missouri Department of Mental Health, one of the important heroes that help in times of disaster.